The discovery. There is a ship on the horizon. You are on the Dei Grazia, a brigantine out of Nova Scotia, sailing eastward across the Atlantic in the first days of December 1872. You have been at sea for several weeks. The Atlantic in December is grey and heavy, the sky low, the swells long and deliberate. You have settled into the rhythm of deep ocean sailing, the watch rotations, the meals, the slow passage of days measured in nautical miles and wind direction. Then one of your lookouts calls out, and you look west, and there is a ship. She is under sail, partially under sail, you notice as you draw closer, with some canvas set oddly, some not set at all. She is moving, but slowly, not under proper control. She is yawing, turning off course, correcting, turning again, the motion of a vessel with no one at the helm. Your captain orders a course change. You draw alongside. You call out. No one answers. You send a boarding party. They climb aboard, and they find nothing. No one. No body, no blood, no sign of violence. The ship is intact, her cargo secure in her hold, her provisions in the galley. The captain's logbook is open on the table. His wife's sewing materials are laid out beside her sewing machine as if she stepped away for a moment. In the cabin aft, a child's toys are scattered on the berth. A bottle of cough medicine stands open on a shelf, its measuring spoon beside it. The crew is gone. All 10 of them. Gone as completely as if they had never been. The ship is the Mary Celeste. The date is December 5, 1872. And the mystery that begins in this moment has never been resolved. The captain of the Dei Grazia was David Morehouse, a Nova Scotian mariner of considerable experience. He had, by a strange coincidence that would later attract the attention of conspiracy theorists, dined with the captain of the Mary Celeste, Benjamin Briggs, just a few weeks earlier in New York, before both ships left port for their respective voyages. They were not close friends, but they were acquaintances in the small world of Atlantic merchant shipping, men who knew each other's names and reputations. When Morehouse's first mate, Oliver Devoe, climbed aboard the Mary Celeste on the morning of December 5, what he found was a scene of profound ordinariness interrupted. The ship was seaworthy. There was no serious damage to the hull or rigging. The cargo, 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, destined for Italy, was largely intact in the hold. The pumps were in working order, though one had been disassembled and its parts were scattered nearby. The compass had been destroyed or removed. The ship's chronometer and sextant, the instruments essential for navigation, were missing. The one lifeboat was gone, apparently launched from the ship. There was some water in the hold, a few feet of it, which could have accumulated through normal seepage or could indicate the ship had been through rough weather. The last entry in the ship's logbook was dated November 25, 9 days before the Dei Grazia found her. The log recorded nothing unusual, a normal day's sailing, a position noted, the routine notation that had been made every day of the voyage. 9 days. Between the last log entry and the discovery, 9 days had passed. 9 days during which something had happened. Something that caused 10 people to leave a sound ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and never be seen again. Oliver Devoe spent several hours on the Mary Celeste before reporting back to Morehouse. His account, given in testimony at the subsequent Admiralty inquiry in Gibraltar, is one of the primary sources for what was found aboard. It is a document of careful observation by a practical seaman who was trying to understand what he was looking at, and its very precision makes it haunting. The galley was in order. There was food aboard, sufficient provisions for several more weeks of sailing. there was water. There was no sign that the crew had left in panic or distress, or at least no sign that was immediately apparent. The cabin where the captain and his family had lived showed the same quality of ordinary interrupted domesticity, a child's slate with writing exercises on it. Sarah Briggs's harmonium, a small reed organ, with a piece of music still open on the stand. The captain's logbook on the table. His sword under the berth. The sword, this is a detail that has attracted considerable attention over the years, partly because of a later fictional embellishment that added bloodstains to it. There were no bloodstains on the sword, and no blood anywhere else on the ship that DeVoe could see. The sword was simply there, under the berth, where perhaps it was always kept. But a sword under the captain's berth, on a merchant vessel, in the middle of the ocean, carries a particular quality of significance when the captain is gone. What DeVoe did not find was any note, any explanation, any farewell, any indication of why the crew had left or where they had gone. The ship's log, the most natural place for a captain to record an emergency decision, ends 9 days before the discovery. If Briggs had written something in those 9 days, it was either in a document that was taken with the crew or in a document that has never been found. The missing lifeboat is the most important physical clue in the Mary Celeste mystery, and it has been the subject of considerable analysis. The ship carried a yawl, a small auxiliary boat, that was normally stored on the main hatch. When DeVoe boarded, the yawl was gone. The fittings on the hatch showed signs of hasty launching. The boat had been put over the side quickly, not in the orderly fashion of a planned departure. This tells us several things. First, the crew left the ship voluntarily, or at least, they had access to the lifeboat and chose to use it. This rules out the most dramatic scenarios. They were not swept overboard by a wave, they were not abducted by some sudden supernatural force, they were not killed and their bodies concealed. They left in the lifeboat. Second, they left in a hurry. The improvised nature of the launch suggests urgency. Something prompted them to get off the ship quickly, without the deliberation that a planned abandonment would have allowed. Third, they intended to return, or at least to stay close. A sounding rope, used to measure the depth of water, had been left rigged over the side, as if they had planned to sound the depth of the sea beneath them, the kind of thing you do if you think the ship might be in danger of running aground, or if you are worried about something happening to the hull. This detail is puzzling in the open Atlantic, far from any shallow water. It suggests either that the crew was in a confused state or that they had a specific concern about the ship's hull that we have not been able to reconstruct. The lifeboat was never found. 10 people in a small open boat in the December Atlantic, far from any land, the outcome of that situation is not hard to imagine. Even if they survived the immediate crisis that drove them off the ship, survival in a lifeboat in those waters, in that season, was not something that could be assumed. The Dei Grazia's crew brought the Mary Celeste into Gibraltar, a prize, under maritime salvage law, that entitled them to a portion of her value. This was standard practice for ships discovered abandoned at sea, and there was nothing improper about the claim. But the Admiralty Court at Gibraltar, presided over by Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General for Gibraltar, was suspicious. Flood was a man of strong opinions and limited flexibility, and his theory of the case was, from the beginning, that the Mary Celeste had been the scene of a crime. He suspected that the crew of the Dei Grazia had murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste, or that the two crews had conspired together in some kind of fraud. His investigation was shaped by this suspicion, and his examination of the ship was designed to find evidence for it. He found almost nothing. A ship's inspector found Some stains on the deck that Flood insisted were blood. Later analysis suggested they were not blood at all, but probably rust stains or some organic material of a non-human origin. The supposed bloodstains on the sword proved equally illusory under closer examination. The inquiry dragged on for months. No evidence of foul play was found. No charges were ever brought. The salvage award was eventually made, though at a significantly reduced level that reflected the court's ongoing suspicions, a kind of punishment for an unproven crime. The crew of the Dei Grazia returned to sea. The crew of the Mary Celeste remained missing. The inquiry ended without answers. The Mary Celeste was eventually returned to her owners, repaired, and put back into service. Her subsequent history is not a happy one. She passed through a series of owners, each of whom found her an unlucky vessel, damaged in storms, involved in disputes, losing money on cargo. The reputation of a ghost ship is not good for business, and the Mary Celeste seems to have been genuinely cursed in the mundane commercial sense. She was old, she was not well suited to the trades she was put into, and she attracted masters who were not the most capable. In 1885, her last captain, Gilman Parker, deliberately wrecked her on a reef off Haiti in an insurance fraud scheme. He collected the insurance, sold the cargo to a merchant in Haiti, and tried to disappear with the money. The scheme was discovered, and Parker was tried for barratry, the deliberate wrecking of a ship for insurance purposes. He was acquitted on a technicality, but his reputation was destroyed, and he died a few months later in poverty. The wreck of the Mary Celeste lies on that Haitian reef today, or what remains of it. In 2001, a team of explorers led by the novelist Clive Cussler claimed to have found the wreck, though the identification has been disputed. She ended ignominiously, this ship. Run aground for profit by a fraud, her remains scattered on a Caribbean reef. It is a dispiriting ending for a vessel that had become one of the most famous ships in history, famous not for anything she did, but for what happened aboard her and what was never explained. The Mary Celeste might have remained an obscure admiralty case, discussed only by maritime historians and maritime lawyers, if not for a story published in 1884 by a young doctor with literary ambitions. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he was 25 years old when he published, in a British magazine, a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. The story purported to be the testimony of a survivor of a mysterious ship abandonment, clearly based on the Mary Celeste, though Conan Doyle changed the name to Marie Celeste, which is how the ship is frequently but incorrectly referred to this day. Conan Doyle's story added elements that had no basis in fact: bloodstains, racial conspiracy, supernatural menace. It was vivid and atmospheric and entirely fictional, but it was presented in the form of a factual account, and many readers took it as such. The Attorney General at Gibraltar, Frederick Solly Flood, wrote an angry letter to the British press insisting that the story was false and demanding a retraction. Conan Doyle declined to retract. The effect of the story was to transform the Mary Celeste from a puzzling but mundane maritime mystery into a legend, a vessel of supernatural associations, a ship from which people had vanished under circumstances too strange for rational explanation. This transformation has never been undone. The Mary Celeste has been written about, dramatized, fictionalized, and theorized about for 150 years, and the fictional version created by Conan Doyle, the ship of inexplicable horrors, has proven more durable than the historical version. The Dei Grazia sails away, her prize crew aboard the Mary Celeste. The Atlantic is gray and immense. The horizon is empty in every direction. Somewhere behind them, 9 days sail away by the last log entry's reckoning. 10 people got into a small boat. They are not here anymore. In Part 2, we go aboard the Mary Celeste before the mystery, before the abandonment, before the inquiry, before the legend. We meet the ship and the people who sailed her. Rest here. Let the ocean settle around you. The water is very deep here. And very quiet. The ship and her people. Let me tell you about the ship herself, and the people who were aboard her. Not the ghost ship of legend, not the vessel of inexplicable mystery and Conan Doyle's invention, but the actual vessel, a brigantine of 280 tons, built in Nova Scotia in 1861, that had sailed the Atlantic dozens of times before her last voyage. A working ship, with a working crew, carrying a cargo of alcohol from New York to Genoa in the autumn of 1872. The Mary Celeste was not a glamorous vessel. She was a merchant ship, built for cargo rather than speed or comfort, aging but serviceable. She had had a somewhat troubled history before her famous voyage. She was originally named Amazon, had been involved in several accidents and ownership disputes, had been wrecked once and refloated, and had passed through several hands before ending up under American ownership and her final name. But she was sound. When DeVoe boarded her on December 5, his assessment was that she was a seaworthy vessel in reasonable condition, capable of completing her voyage. Whatever had happened to drive her crew off did not include the ship sinking beneath them. The Mary Celeste was a brigantine, a two-masted sailing vessel with a distinctive rig combining square sails on the foremast with fore and aft sails on the main mast. This rig made her reasonably fast and maneuverable for a cargo vessel, and suited her to the Atlantic trade she was designed for. She measured approximately 100 feet from bow to stern, with a beam of about 25 feet at her widest point. Her hold, capable of carrying several hundred tons of cargo, was her reason for existing. She was built to move goods across the Atlantic, to connect the commercial world of the eastern United States with the markets of Europe and the Mediterranean. Her accommodations were modest. The captain lived aft, in a cabin that by merchant vessel standards was reasonably comfortable, large enough for a married couple and a small child, with a separate sleeping area and a sitting area where the captain could work on charts and logs and correspondence. The crew lived forward, in the forecastle, in the close quarters that merchant sailors accepted as the normal condition of their working lives. Between these two worlds was the ship's working space, the deck, the hatches, the machinery of sails and rigging that kept her moving. She had been refitted and somewhat enlarged before her final voyage, acquiring a second deck in the hold that increased her cargo capacity. This refit changed her handling characteristics slightly and may have been relevant to her subsequent history, though how exactly is a matter of speculation. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was 37 years old when the Mary Celeste sailed from New York on November 7, 1872. He was from a New England seafaring family. His father was a captain, his brothers were captains. His whole life had been organized around the sea and the commerce of the sea. He had commanded his first vessel in his mid-20s and had built a reputation, over the subsequent decade, as a careful, competent, and deeply religious master. He was a teetotaler, which would later become relevant to one of the theories about what happened aboard his ship. He did not carry alcohol aboard for his personal use, and he reportedly disapproved of its consumption generally. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a serious and conscientious man. Not a man of great warmth, perhaps, but a man of principle and reliability. His correspondence with his mother, preserved in archives and occasionally quoted in works about the Mary Celeste, reveals someone who thought carefully about his responsibilities and took them seriously. He was also, notably, a man who chose to bring his family on this voyage. His wife, Sarah Elizabeth Briggs, née Cobb, was 30 years old. Their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda Briggs, was with them. An older son, Arthur, had been left with his grandmother in Massachusetts. He was of school age, and his education required his presence on land. The decision to bring wife and daughter on a transatlantic voyage was not unusual for captains of the era. Many shipmasters took their families on voyages. It kept families together during what would otherwise be months of separation. It provided the captain with a domestic life at sea, and many captains' wives were genuine working partners who helped with navigation, correspondence, and the management of the ship's provisions. Sarah Briggs's letters from the days before departure have survived. They describe a woman who was looking forward to the voyage with genuine pleasure. She mentions the harmonium she was bringing, plans to make music in the evenings, excitement about visiting the Mediterranean. There is nothing in her correspondence that suggests anxiety or premonition. The crew of the Mary Celeste consisted of 7 men, in addition to the captain and his family. Albert Richardson was the first mate, a 28-year-old from Maine, experienced and trusted, the kind of first mate that a careful captain was glad to have. He was newly married, having wed just before the voyage. The second mate was Andrew Gilling, a 25-year-old. The steward and cook was Edward Head, a 23-year-old who was making his first Atlantic crossing. The 4 seamen were a more international group, 2 German brothers named Lorenzen, a German named Gottschalk, and an Azorian named Martins. This crew profile is worth noting because it has bearing on the theories about what happened. The German brothers, in particular, have attracted some suspicion over the years, theories involving language barriers, misunderstandings, or the particular loyalties of a group of men from the same family serving together. These theories have never been developed into anything convincing. What we know about the crew is that they were, by the available evidence, a normal group of merchant sailors. No complaints were recorded about them. No disciplinary incidents had occurred. The log entries from the voyage suggest a ship running normally, with no hint of the conflict or illness that might have precipitated a disaster. They were, in short, 10 ordinary people on an ordinary voyage who vanished with a completeness that has defied explanation for 150 years. The cargo of the Mary Celeste was 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, loaded in New York and consigned to a firm in Genoa. The alcohol was industrial, not drinkable, treated with additives to make it unpalatable, intended for use in manufacturing. It was the kind of cargo that a merchant vessel like the Mary Celeste regularly carried, not glamorous, not especially valuable per unit, but reliable and in steady demand. The cargo has been central to one of the most discussed theories about what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. It was later discovered, at the inquiry and in subsequent examinations, that 9 of the 1,700 barrels were found to be empty. They were the only ones made of red oak rather than the white oak used for the others, and red oak is a more porous wood that allows more evaporation. The implication is that these 9 barrels had leaked or evaporated their contents into the hold. 1,700 gallons of denatured industrial alcohol, vaporizing into the enclosed space of a ship's hold in the middle of the Atlantic, would create a highly flammable and potentially explosive atmosphere. This observation became the basis for a theory about what drove the crew off the ship, a theory that we will examine in detail in Part 3. The rest of the cargo was intact. When the Mary Celeste arrived in Genoa, accompanied by the Dei Grazia's prize crew, the alcohol was delivered to its consignees and accepted. The cargo that had been the purpose of the voyage was completed, in a sense, even without its crew. The Mary Celeste left New York Harbor on November 7, 1872. The departure was delayed by a week from its original schedule. Some accounts suggest that Benjamin Briggs was having difficulty finding suitable crew members, which was a perennial problem for merchant captains in this era. The days before departure are documented in Sarah Briggs's letters to her mother-in-law. She describes shopping for provisions, settling into the cabin, preparing Sophia's things. She is cheerful and practical. She mentions that Albert Richardson, the first mate, seems like a good man. She notes that the weather looks promising for a good start to the voyage. Benjamin Briggs wrote to his mother on November 3, 4 days before departure. His letter is the last document we have in his own hand. It is an ordinary letter, updates on family matters, plans for the voyage, hopes for good weather. He does not mention any concerns about the ship or the cargo or the crew. The Mary Celeste slipped out of New York Harbor on November 7 and into the Atlantic. The last sighting of her by anyone who was not later to become a mystery was by another vessel, the Reverend James Walter, which reported passing her on November 9, 2 days out of New York. Nothing unusual was observed. After that, the ship was alone in the Atlantic for what we know were at least the next 16 days, from November 9 to November 25, the date of the last log entry. What happened after that, and in particular what happened in the 9 days between November 25 and December 5, has never been established. The last entry in the Mary Celeste's log, made on November 25, 1872, at 9 in the morning, recorded the ship's position as approximately 6 miles north of Santa Maria Island in the Azores. The entry is entirely routine. Wind, course, speed, the standard notations of a ship's log. Nothing unusual. The handwriting, presumably Briggs's own, is clear and unhurried. Santa Maria is the southernmost and oldest of the Azores Islands, a Portuguese archipelago in the mid-Atlantic. The position given in the log places the Mary Celeste in the waters immediately northeast of the island. Having navigated through the Atlantic with reasonable success, she was behind schedule, having taken 18 days to cover a distance that a faster vessel might have covered in 12, but she was on course and making progress. The Dei Grazia found her 9 days later and approximately 400 miles to the east-northeast, in the waters between the Azores and the Portuguese coast. In 9 days, with some sail set and the prevailing winds, she had drifted or sailed this distance without human hands on her helm. 400 miles. 9 days. 10 people. And between these facts, the last log entry and the discovery, a silence that has never been broken. Sarah Briggs's harmonium stands in the cabin, the music still open on the stand. Sophia's toys are on the berth. The cough medicine is open. The sewing kit is laid out, the work half done. These are the traces of people. Not grand people, not historically significant people, ordinary people, going about their lives on an ordinary ship on an ordinary voyage. They are gone. In Part 3, we go through the theories, every serious attempt to explain what happened in those 9 missing days. Rest here. The harmonium is silent. The music waits on its stand. The theories. There have been many theories about what happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste. Some of them are serious, careful attempts to reconstruct a scenario consistent with the physical evidence and the historical record. Some of them are fanciful, the product of the romantic imagination that the story has always attracted. Some of them are somewhere in between, plausible on first examination, revealing their weaknesses only when examined carefully. I want to go through the most significant theories in detail, not to dismiss any of them, but to look honestly at what each one explains and what each one fails to explain. Because the truth about the Mary Celeste, if it exists, is probably somewhere in this territory, a scenario that accounts for most of the evidence, even if it cannot account for all of it. The most widely discussed serious theory about the Mary Celeste is the alcohol vapor hypothesis, the idea that the 9 empty barrels in the hold released enough denatured alcohol vapor to create either an actual explosion or the credible fear of one, and that this fear drove the crew to abandon the ship. The theory was proposed most carefully and compellingly by the historian and nautical expert Brian Hicks, working with computer modeling done at University College London in 2006. The UCL team created a scale model of the Mary Celeste's hold and simulated the release of alcohol vapor from the empty barrels. What they found was striking. The vapor could have produced a series of loud, flame-free pressure explosions, bangs without actual fire, that would have left no permanent physical trace on the ship but would have sounded and felt, to anyone aboard, like the ship was about to blow up. This scenario is elegant because it explains several things simultaneously. It explains why the crew left in a hurry, because they believed the ship was about to explode. It explains why the ship was in good condition when found, because the explosion, if that is what happened, did not actually damage the ship. It explains the open barrels, they had been the source of the vapor. And it explains why there was no fire. The denatured alcohol produces an atypical combustion that generates a pressure wave without a sustained flame. The theory also explains what happened to the crew. If they left the ship in a panic, attached to it by a long rope, planning to pull themselves back aboard once the danger had passed, this has been proposed as the explanation for the sounding rope found rigged over the side, and if that rope broke, they would have been left in the open Atlantic in a small boat with no way back to the ship. In December, with wind and current pushing the ship away from them. The weaknesses of the theory are also real. We cannot be certain that the 9 barrels were empty because of vapor release rather than some other cause. We cannot be certain that vapor from red oak barrels would have reached the explosive concentration suggested. And the sounding rope, as we have noted, is puzzling. Why would you use a sounding rope in the open ocean? But of all the serious theories, this one fits the most evidence while requiring the fewest additional assumptions. A second theory, less well known but carefully argued, proposes that the Mary Celeste was struck by a waterspout, a tornado-like column of rotating water that occasionally occurs in the waters around the Azores, and that the crew abandoned ship in the belief that the spout would sink her. Waterspouts were a recognized hazard in 19th-century Atlantic sailing, and the Azores are in a region where they occur with some regularity. A significant waterspout striking or passing very close to the ship could have caused dramatic flooding of the deck, possibly flooding the hold through improperly secured hatches, and creating the impression that the ship was in danger of sinking. This theory explains the water in the hold. It came from the waterspout, not from a leak. It explains the hasty abandonment. The crew believed they were about to sink. It explains the disassembled pump. Someone had begun pumping before the decision to abandon was made. Its weakness is that waterspouts, while dramatic, rarely cause the kind of catastrophic flooding that would justify abandoning a sound ship. And a waterspout capable of causing that level of fear would likely have left visible damage to the ship's rigging or deck that DeVoe did not report finding. The most dramatic human agency theory is that the abandonment of the Mary Celeste was deliberate, a staged event designed to defraud the insurance companies. The conspiracy theories take various forms. The simplest version suggests that Benjamin Briggs conspired with David Morehouse of the Dei Grazia to abandon the ship and claim salvage, that the two captains, who had dined together before the voyage, hatched a plan in which Briggs would abandon the Mary Celeste and Morehouse would find her and claim a large salvage payment, the proceeds to be split. This theory was implicitly what Frederick Solly Flood was investigating at the Gibraltar Inquiry, and it was never proven because it is almost certainly not true. The salvage award for the Mary Celeste was not large, certainly not large enough to justify a conspiracy involving the deaths of 10 people, which would have been the inescapable consequence of abandoning them in a lifeboat in the December Atlantic. Moreover, Briggs had a substantial personal investment in the Mary Celeste. He was part owner of the vessel, and abandoning it would have been economically damaging to him personally. The more sinister conspiracy theory, that the crew of the Dei Grazia murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste and then invented the discovery story, is even less supported. The logistics of murdering 10 people, disposing of the bodies, and maintaining a consistent cover story across a crew of several men are formidable. The inquiry found no evidence of any of this. Conspiracy theories about the Mary Celeste have a persistent attraction because they offer a human explanation for something otherwise inexplicable. But the evidence does not support any of the specific versions that have been proposed. One of the more exotic serious theories proposes that the Mary Celeste was the victim of a submarine earthquake, a seaquake, whose vibrations, transmitted through the water and into the hull, caused the crew to believe that the ship was breaking up. Seaquakes are real phenomena. The Atlantic floor between the Azores and the Iberian Peninsula is seismically active. The same tectonic forces that created the Azores also produce periodic underwater earthquakes, and the vibrations from such events can be felt by ships in the area as a dramatic shaking or bumping sensation, as if the hull were striking rocks or being hammered from below. A significant seaquake experienced by sailors who did not understand what they were feeling could have been terrifying. The sensation of the ship apparently disintegrating beneath their feet, combined with the panicked assumption that they had struck a reef or that the hull was failing, might have been sufficient to drive them off the ship in the belief that it was about to sink. This theory is creative but faces the same fundamental problem as the waterspout theory. It explains why the crew might have panicked and left, but it does not explain why a professional mariner like Benjamin Briggs would have abandoned a sound ship without conducting any inspection of the hull. Briggs had years of experience at sea. He would not have abandoned his vessel, his wife, and his daughter without being very certain that the ship was lost. One of the theories that receives less attention than it perhaps deserves is the possibility that something went wrong within the crew, a conflict, a illness, a breakdown of discipline that resulted in the deaths of the captain and family and the subsequent panic and flight of the surviving crew. The evidence against this theory is largely the absence of any physical evidence, no blood, no signs of violence, no bodies. But we should be careful about treating the absence of evidence as evidence of absence. If a conflict resulted in deaths, the bodies might have gone over the side. If the violence was limited, a stabbing, say, rather than a bludgeoning, it might not have produced the large bloodstains that 19th-century investigators were looking for. The German brothers have been the focus of this theory in its various versions. Two brothers serving together on a ship create a natural power block that might, under sufficiently adverse circumstances, challenge the authority of the captain. If a confrontation occurred, and if it turned violent, the subsequent departure of the survivors in the lifeboat would explain the ship's abandonment. This theory cannot be ruled out. But it also cannot be substantiated with the available evidence, and it requires a sequence of events whose motivation is unclear. What would have driven men with no recorded history of violence to such an extreme action? After 150 years of investigation, theory, and speculation, what can we say with genuine confidence about what happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste? We can say with confidence that they left the ship voluntarily. The missing lifeboat establishes this. They were not swept overboard, they were not abducted, they were not killed on the ship. They made a decision, however mistaken, however panicked, to leave. We can say with confidence that they left in a hurry. The evidence on board, the disassembled pump, the impression of a hasty departure, the sounding rope, suggests urgency rather than deliberation. We can say with confidence that they almost certainly died in the lifeboat. 10 people in a small open boat in the December Atlantic, far from any land, with no means of navigation and no way back to their ship, the odds of survival were vanishingly small. No trace of them was ever found. No member of the crew ever resurfaced anywhere. What we cannot say with confidence is why they left. The alcohol vapor theory, the waterspout theory, the seaquake theory, each of them fits some of the evidence and fails to fit some of the evidence. The truth was probably something simpler and more specific than any of these reconstructions, a particular event, on a particular afternoon, experienced by particular people in a particular state of mind. That event is beyond our reach. The theories are laid out. Each one explains something. None explains everything. And the gap between what can be explained and what actually happened is where the mystery lives, where it has lived for 150 years, and where it will probably continue to live. In Part 4, we sit with what the Mary Celeste means, not just as a maritime mystery, but as something larger. What does it say about us that we find this story so compelling? What does the sea mean to us, and what does it mean that it keeps its secrets so completely? Rest here. Somewhere in the Atlantic, the water is very deep. And somewhere beneath it, perhaps, the answers lie. What the sea keeps. The sea keeps its secrets. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal fact about the physical world. The ocean, particularly the deep ocean, the abyssal zones where the water is cold and black and the pressure is crushing, is one of the least explored environments on Earth. More of the surface of the Moon has been mapped in detail than the floor of the deep ocean. More is known about the surface of Mars than about the deepest trenches of the Pacific. And in those depths, in the cold and the dark and the silence, an enormous number of things have been lost. Ships, cargoes, people, histories. The ocean does not give back what it takes. It preserves some things, the Titanic, the Bismarck, the wrecks of ancient vessels found in the Black Sea, but these are the exceptions, the shallow water accidents where conditions happen to be right for preservation. Most of what the ocean takes, it keeps. The Mary Celeste is one of the most famous things the ocean has taken, because what was taken was not a ship or a cargo but a mystery, a question that was left unanswered and that the ocean will not help us answer. The ocean has always been one of the primary territories of the human imagination. In the ancient world, the sea was the edge of the known, the place where the familiar world ended and the unknown began. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the horizon, there were monsters and voids and things that had no names. The sea was the boundary between the comprehensible and the incomprehensible, and it carried all the psychological freight of that boundary. This ancient relationship between human beings and the ocean has never entirely changed, even as the ocean has been mapped and crossed and studied and traversed by technologies that ancient sailors could not have imagined. The sea remains, in the human imagination, a place of mystery. Not because we are ignorant of its geography, we have charted its currents, measured its depths, catalogued its organisms, but because it is so genuinely vast, so genuinely alien, so genuinely indifferent to human presence and human concerns. The Mary Celeste speaks to this ancient feeling. It is the story of people who went into the ocean and did not come back, or rather, it is the story of their absence, of what remained when they were gone, of the ship sailing on without them. It is a story about the sea's capacity to take people and leave no trace, no explanation, no conclusion. The Mary Celeste is not the only ghost ship in history, and the genre of the ghost ship, the vessel found drifting, crewless, under mysterious circumstances, has a long history in maritime tradition. The Flying Dutchman, the most famous fictional ghost ship, represents the extreme version of the archetype, a ship condemned to sail forever, its crew unable to make port. The story probably originated in real sightings of ships in distress, vessels caught in storms that were seen but could not be approached, and accumulated supernatural associations over centuries of retelling. Real ghost ships are less dramatic but no less haunting. Throughout the history of sail and steam, vessels have been found abandoned in the open sea, their crews gone, their stories untold. Some of these cases have been explained. The Joyita, found in the Pacific in 1955, was eventually determined to have been the victim of engine failure and flooding, its crew having abandoned ship onto rafts that were never found. Others remain genuinely unexplained. What the Mary Celeste represents, in the tradition of ghost ship stories, is the purest version of the archetype, a ship in perfect condition, found abandoned, whose crew vanished without leaving a comprehensible explanation. This purity is what has kept her story alive for 150 years. There is no ambiguity, no partial explanation, no loose thread that can be pulled to unravel the mystery. The mystery is complete. The Mary Celeste has been a cultural touchstone for 150 years, and her story has shown a remarkable capacity for mutation and embellishment. Conan Doyle's 1884 story was the first major embellishment, adding racial conspiracy and violence to what was, in the historical record, a mystery of silence and absence. Subsequent versions have added sea monsters, alien abduction, time portals, the Bermuda Triangle, geographically impossible, given the ship's location, but that has not stopped the association from being made, and various supernatural explanations. These embellishments are not interesting because they might be true, they are not, but because of what they reveal about the needs the story serves. The Mary Celeste is a mystery that cannot be solved, and human beings are profoundly uncomfortable with mysteries that cannot be solved. We reach for explanations, and when the available explanations are insufficient, we reach for larger and stranger ones. The supernatural theories about the Mary Celeste are a measure of the inadequacy of the natural theories. They represent the imagination's attempt to provide a satisfying ending to a story that has none. A sea monster is, in a perverse way, more comforting than the alcohol vapor theory, because it provides a complete narrative, a clear cause and effect, an image that the mind can rest on. The truth, that we probably never will know exactly what happened, that the answer is lying at the bottom of the Atlantic in the bones of 10 people who cannot speak, is much harder to accept. I want to return, near the end, to the people. Benjamin Briggs was 37 years old. He had been sailing since his teens, had commanded ships for 15 years, had a reputation as a careful and conscientious master. He left behind a son, Arthur, who was 7 years old when his father disappeared. Arthur grew up without knowing what had happened to his father, his mother, and his sister. He died in 1926, at the age of 60, having outlived the century that contained his family's disappearance, having never learned the answer. Sarah Briggs was 30 years old. She was, by the evidence of her letters, a woman of intelligence and warmth and ordinary human happiness. She was looking forward to the voyage. She had packed her harmonium, made plans for evenings of music, prepared her daughter's things for the journey. Sophia Matilda was 2 years old. She had a slate with writing exercises on it, which she could not yet write on herself. Her mother or father had been teaching her letters, preparing her for a future of reading and writing and the ordinary life of a New England girl in the 1870s. These 3 people, and the 7 crew members who sailed with them, are the center of the mystery. Not the ship is just wood and rope and canvas. The mystery is the people. Where did they go? What happened to them? Did they suffer? Were they afraid? We will never know. The ocean has them. There is a question that the Mary Celeste forces us to ask about our relationship to historical mystery. What do we owe to the unexplained? We live in a culture that is deeply impatient with uncertainty, that assumes, usually correctly, that patient investigation will eventually explain anything. The scientific method, applied with sufficient resources over sufficient time, has explained phenomena that would have seemed permanently mysterious to earlier generations. We have decoded the genome, mapped the cosmic microwave background, identified the molecular mechanisms of memory. There is a cultural assumption that mystery is a temporary condition, a gap in our knowledge that will eventually be filled. The Mary Celeste challenges this assumption. There are no more physical clues to find. The ship itself is gone, wrecked and scattered. The people are gone. The documents that existed have been examined and re-examined. The mystery is, in a practical sense, permanently open. What do we do with permanently open mysteries? We can ignore them, move on to questions that can be answered. We can romanticize them, fill them with supernatural explanations that satisfy the imagination even as they insult the intelligence. Or we can sit with them honestly, acknowledge the limits of what can be known, accept the discomfort of the unanswered question, and find a way to be at peace with not knowing. The Mary Celeste is a test of that capacity. It is a story that ends in silence, and the silence is the point. The ocean is very large and very deep, and it does not owe us explanations. Arthur Briggs grew up in Massachusetts, knowing only that his father, mother, and sister had sailed away and not come back. He married, had children, lived a long life. He was, as far as the record shows, a decent and ordinary man, the kind of person history does not usually record. In 1913, when he was an adult in his 40s, he gave an interview to a newspaper about the Mary Celeste. He said, with quiet dignity, that he had spent his life hoping for an explanation and that he had made his peace with not receiving one. His grandchildren are alive today. His great-grandchildren. The absence that began on a November morning in 1872, when a ship left New York Harbor and was never explained, has rippled through more than a century of a family's life. The mystery is not just a puzzle. It is a wound, a permanent absence at the center of people's lives, a gap where a father and a mother and a sister should have been. And the gap has never been filled, because the ocean will not give back what it took. The Atlantic is very old. It has been here for 180 million years, opening slowly as the continents drifted apart, filling with water from the rain and the rivers and the long geological processes that no human being was alive to witness. It has seen things we cannot imagine and forgotten things we will never know. On December 5, 1872, a ship was found drifting in the Atlantic, empty, her crew gone. The ship was repaired and put back to sea. Eventually she was wrecked and sunk, and her timbers rotted on a Caribbean reef, and now even the wreck is mostly gone. But the story has not gone. It is the story of 10 people who sailed into the sea and did not come back, not dramatically, Not heroically, but quietly, the way the ocean takes most of what it takes, without warning and without explanation. Sarah Briggs's harmonium stood in the cabin, the music open on the stand, for 9 days after the last log entry. 9 days of Atlantic wind and wave, the ship moving east without anyone to play it. The music was still there when DeVoe came aboard. Waiting, perhaps, to be played. It was never played again. The sea does not explain itself. It does not apologize. It simply moves, and the light moves on it, and somewhere far below the surface the cold is absolute and the dark is complete and the silence is the kind of silence that has no end. Good night.